All right, why don't we get started? Will continue to trickle in, which is fine, but great of all of you to come and to be part of this wonderful opportunity to talk to a great friend and colleague and a great public servant, Damon Wilson. You've, I'm sure, sort of seen the bio. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, but it is an extraordinary record of public service, which we appreciate immensely here at SAIS. And particularly because it's a trajectory which will, I think, look to many of you as something that as you think about your careers and where you're headed, something that you could think about how this might translate into your own goals and aspirations. Because Damon, who I first met when I was at the NSC and he was at the NSC as an intern coming out of his master's program at another distinguished institution up the road a little bit. But has had a career both in the NGO and sort of think tanky world and government, which really reflects a set of experiences and engagements around a broad range of issues that have a sort of a common thread about the role of the United States in the world and the opportunity for a country like the United States and a democracy like the United States to make a difference in the world. And from his very early work with Save the Children in Rwanda to his current job as the CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, it really reflects an incredible personal commitment and a sense of opportunity of what a difference an individual might be able to make if they care enough about the issues. And his service again in several capacities in the government, at the White House and the State Department, and with the Atlantic Council, with the NATO Secretary General's office, which was a really remarkable experience. I hope we'll hear a little bit about today, and then finally with the National Endowment. So it's great for all of us to have Damon here and to hear a little bit about both his own personal trajectory and career, but also the issues now facing the National Endowment at a time in which there's a lot of debate about the nature and future of democracy. So I do want to start by just asking him to talk a little bit about, how did he, go from being a master's student at a School of International Affairs to his career, and talk a little bit about the trajectory that led him first to work in the humanitarian field and then on to government service and leadership in some of these international institutions.
First of all, let me say it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for coming out. I just had a great session with SAIS Pride as well. Really looking forward to the conversation. But first of all, let me say it's sort of also incredible being here because, like, I was an intern when he was Deputy National Security Advisor, and it's just I have goosebumps having a chance to have a conversation with you here. You may know him as Dean. People call him Secretary. For me, he's always the Deputy National Security Advisor. When I was a graduate student at Princeton, I spent a summer in African Affairs working for then Susan Rice, the Senior Director. And as Deputy National Security Advisor during the course of our time there over the summer, Jim hosted all the interns in his office in a meeting that was probably squeezed between deputies, committees, crises on X, Y, and Z, he doesn't remember. And yet that experience left an indelible impact on me, just making me hungry for more public service, because I saw at a very young age in grad school, going into government service, people working on really important issues who were world-class, extraordinary, working really hard against all the stereotypes of bureaucrats and everything you heard. And it just left such an impact, an impression on me, particularly in NSC, a quality of a team working together. And your leadership at the time was really remarkable. And so it is a pleasure to be here. How did I sort of get on this career path a little bit? We were just talking to a few students before this. I grew up in the Carolinas, and I didn't have a lot of opportunity to travel around the world, see the world very much. I was just sharing that as a third grader, my best friend was the son of a dissident from Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania. His father had to flee, brought his family, and in third grade, I didn't really understand Nicolae Ceausescu, communism, tyranny, but I saw what it meant for my best friend and his family, this third grader, and that they had to flee. And it helped me understand at a very early age that what we took for granted as growing up in the Carolinas was something that a lot of people couldn't take for granted. compounded in high school. My best friend was from Iran, Baha'i faith, his family persecuted both for their religious beliefs and as Iran went through its own tumultuous revolution. And going at home with him after school and his mother cooking for us, just feeling the impact of what lack of freedom meant for people who had to flee, pick up their lives, and start over from scratch. And it left a real impact on me. You are beginning your careers at an incredibly tumultuous time in history. It's really a little bit terrifying, very exciting. It's a bit of a jump ball, but it's we were talking about an inflection point where you're going to be helping to shape what comes. And when I was in your position, when I was born, there were I think less than 30 democracies when I was born. By the time I was in college, almost 80. Watching the collapse of the Soviet Union, spending the first times of my experience at university overseas, living in the Baltic states, their first year of independence, but very quickly seeing the dark side of this in the Balkans, Rwanda. That was really where I was enamored and taken by the world, because you could tell that we were living in history. You could tell that things were happening, and knowing that I love culture, language, history, background of countries, but knowing that you were living in a period where you could touch history. And I felt that working for refugee projects in the Balkans, and I ended up going to work for Save the Children of Rwanda right after the genocide. And it was there that I really loved the humanitarian work, incredibly compelling, loved the work for Save the Children, helping to locate kids that had been separated from their families during a genocide, or women that were taking their kids into prison because they were accused of committing genocide in these just incredibly horrid conditions. Really important work on a humanitarian side. But the situations I saw as a student in the Balkans, in Central Africa, it was pretty clear to me were driven by power-hungry, autocratic, corrupt actors leveraging and manipulating the cleavages in society for their own effect. It wasn't just spontaneous ethnic hatred, as a lot of the news wanted to cover at the time. And that's really what led me to say, as much as I love Save the Children, I don't want to be neutral in this environment. I want to help shape better outcomes. And that's what drove me into public service. That's what led me to pick Princeton over Kabul to come back to graduate school. And in a great stroke of luck, in part because I had spent time on the ground in Rwanda, to have an opportunity as a graduate student to join the NSC and to work for an incredible team there on African affairs and get my first taste of public service. I did have an internship for my senator when I was an undergrad, so that was my first taste in Washington. And that really helped get me attached to public service, Jim.
So you had an early exposure to some of the most horrific experiences that we've experienced in modern times. And one could imagine that you would look at those things and kind of despair, right? I mean, you saw on the ground what I saw from a greater distance in Rwanda and more broadly in the Great Lakes and so many other parts of the world. What gave you the sense that it wasn't all too big, too hopeless, that you as an individual could make a difference in affecting these things?
That is tough, because I think we have to come to anything we're doing with a healthy dose of humility. We were just talking a little bit about how you can make a lot of mistakes when you don't come to the table with humility and with a sense of understanding that you've got a lot to learn. And so part of it began with just a humility of service, feeling that compunction, that compelling nature of wanting to help give back and to help, to be in service. And in some respects, I felt, even today in my job, I felt throughout my career that this wasn't just a job, but it was more of a calling. It's what I felt driven to do, which is the best way to intersect with your own career. So you've got that internal churn. You're not looking for gimmicks to motivate you. You're motivated by what's there. But I also came to see, just as I saw in Rwanda and the Balkans, it wasn't a hopeless, just ancient ethnic hatreds. It was a clique of individuals, bad apples that were powerful using Hungary. A small group of individuals could wreak extraordinary havoc. And yet the inverse is true. That actually a small group of people, you might know the Margaret Mead quote, a small group of people working together can change the world for the better. In fact, it's the only thing that leads to change. And I think kind of seeing up front the news, when you're reading about news, it can become a big blur and there's a lack of agency. Even when we talk about backsliding democracies, I like to talk about deconsolidating. Somebody's doing something to do that. There are individuals behind that story. And so just as I felt the individuals behind a lot of negative things in the world, a lot of evil in the world, it's just individuals working together that actually do the inverse and that are helping others, help give people some opportunity, let them be who they want to be, support some of those freedoms. And it gave me that sense of almost the power of people working together. And I got to see some of that with, the resilience of Bosnian refugees and communities I worked in Turkey or throughout the Balkans, to see many of these communities in Rwanda that had been, just how personal it was neighbor on neighbor, how personal the conflict was. And yet to see how people could stitch this back together and create a community that could absorb the kids that had lost their parents. And it gives me a sense of what the potential of people doing together can achieve. And it helps make it feel like, okay, it's not so out of your reach. There are things you can do. Having humility helps, but seeing the problem as too big that it's not worth trying isn't going to do anything to help us solve that problem.
So you kind of got into this business, as you said, at a time when it seemed like democracy was, if not on the march, then on a vivid stroll, right? That, our good friend and colleague Frank Fukuyama, not fairly, but, was sort of characterized as, feeling that, the end of history would come, that we'd overcome communism, and that the only demonstrated path forward was open democracies. And of course, the story has turned out to be more complicated. A lot of punditry around the backsliding around democracy, looking at the Freedom House Index and others, seeing some negative trends. How does it look in your current seat? I mean, both what's your diagnosis about why the optimism wasn't realized, and then how do you look at it now in terms of what you think both you can do as an organization and we as a society can do to address whatever you think the root causes are of this phenomenon?
Yeah, exactly. It's partly why I came to this job, because I think it is one of the most important issues. Will you be in your career in a continuing authoritarian resurgence and democratic recession that goes on for decades? That's going to lead to a lot of really bad outcomes for people around the world. Or will you be in your career, and better yet, will you be part of supporting those around the world who will ensure that we live when the fourth historical democratic wave of democratization begins? And it's partly why I came to the endowment, because I can't think of any more important issue for the well-being of people around the world. And you're right. In many respects, we got it wrong. I was on a high when I was at your age, just seeing, I saw both the opportunity and it's what got me so fascinated with the transition from communism, got me involved in NATO enlargement, all these types of issues. I saw the possibility, the opportunity. And importantly for me, they weren't, because I got to know people early, right after the fall of the wall, right after the independence of the Baltic states, I saw what it meant for these people. And a lot of people say, did we screw up? Did we do things wrong? And yet I knew a lot of people, and you think about 100 million people who all of a sudden go through a process where they're freer, they're wealthier. I mean, thank goodness that wave of democratization happened, and at least in Europe where we worked on NATO enlargement. But we encountered real headwinds. And I think we totally underestimated this. This wasn't a benign environment in which people's inner yearnings could help determine the trajectory of history. Autocrats weren't giving up without a fight. And I think we missed some of the shortcomings that have led to problems in our own societies, Great Recession, overreach in Iraq, things that led to a lot of questioning and disruption. But I think we also missed what became a conclusion among autocrats, that it wasn't just about protecting themselves, but democracy was an existential challenge. Its existence was an existential challenge. Because in some ways, I will still defend Frank. And Frank Fukuyama is a good friend of the National Endowment. It's easy to lampoon the argument, the end of history. And yet today, the Chinese Communist Party goes to great lengths to explain how it's a democracy, how it's redefining democracy. If you watch the UN Human Rights Council and you see these incredible human rights violators on the council, they are working to pass resolutions that redefine how we think about human rights. And I think about that and I'm disturbed and concerned, reshaping international norms. But in some respects, the underlying premise is that Frank might have been somewhat more right than we give him credit, that they've seeded the existential argument that legitimacy is based in people, and that the concept of democracy confers that legitimacy, and that there are certain fundamental universal human rights that people yearn for and that they have rights to. And rather than say, no, that's not the case, they're trying to redefine, reshape, manipulate that. And so now we find ourselves in a funk. We're in a problem. As your dean said, it's almost 2 decades, I think 16, 17 years of a democratic recession, more countries going in the wrong direction than the right direction, according to Freedom House data. But I think it's actually more significant than that, because I think the last decade it's been sharper. Yes, it's rocky because there's democratic erosion. When democracies go wobbly and uncertain, that North Star is dimmed. It's a problem. But now we see an authoritarian resurgence in which it's sharper repression at home, and we see that in the numbers of Burmese, Russians, Chinese, Iranians, that are Afghans. These are democratic diasporas on steroids, not onesies and twosies and dissidents here and there. Large numbers of people because of that sharp repression at home, but combined with now the autocrats exporting the tools, tactics, technologies of repression, creating, as Anne Applebaum is so well written about, sort of autocracy Inc., backing each other up in a way that leverages a new environment in which we thought there would be a lot of opportunity for freedom, but there's also a dark side to it. An information environment that incentivizes polarization and is open to disinformation campaigns. A technological environment that has enabled AI surveillance for observation and tracking. Financial networks, even in open societies, that have become transnational kleptocratic means that we see Wagner troops in the Central African Republic controlling diamond and gold mines, forcing the country to adopt Bitcoin as national currency to avoid sanctions and scrutiny to fund Wagner Group operations in Ukraine today. It's a system. It's much more complex. It's got much more sophisticated. And so we have to think, we have to innovate, we have to raise our game. And so we are in a funk, we're in a challenge right now. I think it's a real problem, but it's partly why I'm committed to this work. It's partly why I still, over the long term, am optimistic about being able to respond. But man, we're in a fight for these rights right now.
So there's so many directions we could go. It's a great set of observations. But let me start with one that's close to both of our hearts, right? Which is, you talked about Central and Eastern Europe. And I, too, spent a lot of time there both before the wall fell and had a lot of friends and colleagues, who were at RFE and others, working the challenges before the end of communism, and then very personally involved with the transitions. So, and you talk about autocracies, but it strikes me that this is not a homogeneous group, right? And what troubles a lot of people about what we see in Central and Eastern Europe, and it isn't just Hungary and Orban. You can say there are elements of this in Poland. Hopefully we may be coming out of this in the Czech Republic now, but we saw a lot of it there. We even see some of it in Italy and other places, is that the premise of NATO enlargement and the whole move was that what we were doing was protecting the opportunity for people who had communism and autocracy imposed on them to choose their own way of life. And at some level, they're choosing, right? And what they're choosing doesn't look like a lot of the values that we associate, not just with ballot box democracy, but the broader sets of values around democracy. So how do we understand that phenomenon as opposed to the kind of autocratic manipulation you see in states where people aren't free to make choices?
Yeah. It's we're in this populist bout that affects so many democracies, including our own, and it's had a sharpness that it's had different variants in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's, look, I don't have all the answers, but when I think about it, our whole premise of the world we were entering, a more globalized and interconnected world, maybe the March of Freedom, was also premised on opening our economies, integrating China into the World Trade Organization. And we saw a few things happen on the way to the paradise that Frank had discussed. It hit people hard. I'm from South Carolina, and when you drive through rural South Carolina, it doesn't always look great. And you think about deindustrialization in the Midwest. You think about things in Central Europe, where in some respects I watch this a lot with a lot of colleagues who now, after sort of living in freedom, living under democracy, their point of reference isn't how Muscovites are living. It's so easy for them to go to Vienna, Berlin, London, and to feel that gap. And an objective way in which per capita GDP numbers have gone dramatically skyrocketing. I remember particularly Poland, where you had seen some of the most aggressive growth. Law and justice first came to power on driving home sort of the economic failure of the previous government, juxtaposed against what you see across the border. And with social media, everybody around the world now sees and understands that. It also led to social sort of cleavages and disconnect. And part of this is you've seen many of these populists have put taking care of rural communities at the heart of public policy. And so one of the reasons law and justice have maintained such high support in Poland is by introducing very significant social welfare benefits for large families, for children, for those in rural communities, and it had a palpable impact on levels of poverty in rural communities. It was public policy that many people really responded to in socially conservative environments. Now, does that have to be coupled with complete takeover of state media actors to turn them into partisan media hacks? That's what becomes quite disturbing. And so we've seen this in the Czech Republic, the potential almost of oligarchic capture that's been pushed back on. Civil society has responded, citizens have responded, but the Czech Republic has gone through a really interesting model here. In Poland, you see a populist party going into overreach, facing real competitive elections coming this fall. And in Hungary, you see a much darker case, one that I think is intrinsically linked to one of the most pernicious factors out there, corruption. And at the essence of deals between Moscow and Budapest, a Hungary that felt the European Union wasn't being responsive enough on its own energy security, doing some pretty shady, dark deals with Moscow, not just gas, but nuclear, that directly enrich the pockets of political elite, have totally turned and have created a real existential challenge to democracy in Hungary today. These are all actually quite different, but it is part of what happened with sort of the space of freedom that was introduced in Central and Eastern Europe. And yet you look to the east of this, And you see the unrelenting push now of Ukrainians who are really just demanding and fighting for the ability to determine their own future. And so part of what democracy doesn't deliver perfect outcomes. Actually, democracy often delivers the wrong public policies or problems here. It's subject to populist bouts. But in essence, if it works and the institutions hold, it builds in self-correcting mechanisms. And so what becomes very dangerous is when you see these self-correcting mechanisms being neutered, as they are in some of the situations we've talked about.
So you anticipate my next question, which is, so there's another category of the autocracies which, I mean, I take your point, they feel the need to kind of make a pro forma deference to democracy in their rhetoric, but nobody would claim that the Leninist party of China is a democracy, right? I mean, they don't have elections. They know what's best for the people, right? Which is not what we think of democracy, which is the people know what's best for the people. But clearly one of their arguments is on this point that you made, which is that does democracy really deliver good outcomes? I mean, it may feel like in a kind of John Rawlsian sense it's just, but if it doesn't deliver good outcomes, and the argument that's being made is to, the what about argument, which is that, that you hear from the Chinese and others, is to look at how democracies are performing. Is that really the best that can be done? Is this something that's a model? So the brand, which you are the brand bearer of as the National Endowment for Democracy, is sort of being challenged on the outcomes basis. So how do you answer the question about the performative quality of democracy as opposed to the kind of the a priori justice of democracy?
Yeah, I guess a couple of ways. One, before I left the Atlantic Council, I helped start a project on prosperity and freedom that really sort of looked at correlation between open societies, free societies, and what it means for prosperity, wealth, economic development, and the strongest correlation and factor of prosperity actually being rule of law, a fundamental tenet of this. And so there's a ton of research out there, but there's a whole interesting body that's developing. And look, you can look at some of the obvious cases. North Korea, South Korea, where there's a 52% difference in per capita GDP based on the evolution of one peninsula, one under a totalitarian regime, one under an open free society. You can even compare this between Taiwan, Hong Kong pre-crackdown, and mainland China, and see sort of the wealth of the pace of growth 3 times more in Taiwan. You could have done that with East Germany, West Germany. You could see some of these cases in which democracy really ultimately was about delivering greater, not just freedoms, but actually wealth and prosperity. And the whole premise of an international rules-based order being that it's actually in a democracy's interest for not just democracy to flourish, but open economies, because we can be free and get rich together. I mean, that was kind of the theme. That was kind of the premise. And yet you see that challenge. You see that challenge by a wealthy China that's focused on Belt and Road and investments. We are still seeing data and correlation research that still underpins across the world. And now part of this effort has been to pull research data from a lot of developing countries that still show correlation between the elements of an opening free society, with rule of law still being the most compelling, having the most direct link to economic outcomes of growth. And I think that's a fundamental bedrock. The inverse is also what we see, is that the way in which autocrats with money, capitalist autocrats, engage, and it's not authoritarian capitalism. Authoritarian capitalism usually means kleptocracy. And so it's not just evenly spread wealth that's growing for your whole populations, it's extraordinary wealth concentrated also in the hands of those that control the means. But what we're seeing is that much of that engagement, whether it's in Africa, Latin America, becomes not just a means for economic development, building of roads and bridges, which is quite needed. There could be real terms on which this could be done in a way that's real beneficial to communities. But it's coupled with an erosion of those countries' rule of law, by a capturing of those countries' elite, political leaders on the dole, media that's bought up, reporting that's diverted, and it comes with the erosion of their ability to maintain rule of law. So it's complex because China has wealth, has money behind it in a way that's quite different. But we're in a, if you think about where we were at the beginning of 2022 and 2023, in the beginning of 2022, Vladimir Putin's troops surrounding Ukraine, going off to the Olympics in Beijing, Xi Jinping riding high as he's consolidating power, getting ready for the Party Congress, the special No Limits partnership, the autocracy, the Ayatollah Khomeini sitting comfortable in Tehran, and you flash forward just 1 year, and because of mistakes of their own commission that are built into non-democratic systems, lack of flow of information, the inability to have open, transparent debate, the hubris that comes from sycophantic bureaucracies that just respond to leaders, what looks like strongmen, these built-in fragilities to the system, and each of them have found themselves at the beginning of this year in a real crisis of their system's own making. And so I think the verdict is still out, and I think it's too simple to point to that the messiness of democracies is a reason that they don't deliver for their people. It's a reminder that democracy is messy, depends on the engagements of its citizens, and the whole premise of democracy is that unsatisfaction with the status quo is what drives societal change, is self-correcting, drives improvement. It's not linear, but it's part of how you see that evolution in time to be responsive to people's needs.
So just staying on the economic point, and recognizing that there's obviously a lot of heterogeneity among democracies, but one might concede the point about democracy, about prosperity, and then ask about inequality, right? And then the question about, at least in important democracies where we're seeing a significant increase in inequality. So gross wealth is high, but it's to an extraordinary degree, and you know the numbers, becoming concentrated in a very small number. So if it's self-correcting, how do we reconcile the idea that it's supposed to be self-correcting, and yet we see this enormous acceleration in trends towards?
And I'm not the one to provide the public policy answer for that, but if you think about, if you look at you look at American history, you look at democratic histories, the scale of challenges and injustice that we often have in our society can be enormous. You think about our own history, and yet it is that, where does the research come from? The transparency about the issue, the fact of the mobilizing of social dissatisfaction with it, turning into freedom of association to create civic groups that are pushing, becoming political agendas, holding candidates responsible, pushing for legislation. So these things don't happen quickly. Democracy is not the solution. It is a means through which there is a way to be accountable to those pressures of responsiveness. And I think that is the story of any democracy, is the convulsion of people's dissatisfaction with their circumstances and status quo, and yet having some modicum of ability to help shape that outcome by putting pressure to bear, having the institutions and politicians be responsive to those concerns and be accountable. In many respects, that inequality is a bit of the convulsion our system has been going into to say, this didn't work. 2008 financial crisis that began on Wall Street, devastated middle class and impacted the world. Well, that has reverberated through our politics big time. It's still reverberating. And so I think this is, again, I don't think you can think that democracy in and of itself delivers perfect outcomes. It creates an ability in which people can help complain, shape, and change those outcomes. And that's what's crucial to keep the self-correcting mechanism, if you will.
So you're rightly talking about democracy a bit in the abstract here, right? And as I said, there's a lot of heterogeneity among democracies. But for better or worse, you are the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, right? You're not an IGO. And so a lot of the question is not generally about what democracy deliver, but the U.S. brand, right? And so when we look at these things, you talk about whether it's self-correcting or not. I gather that President Biden is going to talk about the inequality and the rich tonight, but we haven't seen it. I just was looking at some data, for example, on inheritance taxes in the states. I mean, there's not a lot. Thomas Piketty, if he were here, would suggest that at least the institutions here aren't doing a lot of self-correction. But my broader question is, so, I mean, you are not just the U.S., right? But because you're clearly funded by Congress and all of that, how does the current U.S. brand affect your ability to do this? And I mean, I know the standard lines were imperfect and we're trying to do better, but as a practical matter, given the challenges that we face in a range of issues, from inequality to race to guns to all of this stuff, how does that impact your ability to do your work, and how do you try to address that question?
It has a big impact. But Jim, let me just on that first point about, the inequality issue. If you were in Venezuela, China, Russia, Iran, and you wrote as you were writing your research report on inequality, capturing how the elites had used the system to enrich themselves, you'd be in jail. That's what I'm talking about. You're not in jail for pointing out the failures when you're in a free society. And I think that's a fundamental issue. Do we have problems? Oh my God, yeah. Are you going to prison for talking about them? You're not. That matters. I mean, that's so fundamental. And so we have the ability to talk about this, and that's really important. So when I think about, first of all, it's a huge issue. When the United States is screwed up, rocky, January 6th happening, what's going on, it is destabilizing for the idea of what's happening with, does democracy deliver, how to think about this. It does have a palpable impact around the world and worries people. However, I do see that they aren't driven by us. They're driven by their own yearnings, their own desires, their own families for change. It's disheartening when they see the disruption or problems that the United States might have. And yet, a couple of things. I'm at the Endowment right now, in part because the Endowment went through a dramatic change, doubled in size. We doubled in size under the Trump administration, an administration that tried to cut the budget. And in response, Democrats and Republicans came together in Congress, and they didn't declare war on President Trump, but they doubled our budget to send the signal about how and it was actually Republicans led, working with Democrats, that took the initiative to double the investment in democracy support, to underscore the importance and the commitment of seeing how critical it is to support these values, support democracy around the world. I think that's quite interesting. So in some respects, the Endowment grew out of a pressure from the left, Jimmy Carter focusing on human rights. The first civil society ever to support other civil society was the AFL-CIO labor unions supporting solidarity in Poland. And then it came from the right, President Ronald Reagan 40 years ago in a big speech that led to the creation of the NED, Global Infrastructure for Democracy, anti-communism, standing up to this. And the Endowment itself builds together Democrats, Republicans, business, and labor. We have 4 core institutes that bind all of these in America, groups that fight the heck out of each other, coming together to support the concept of the Endowment. And so on the one hand, I say our contribution, we do democracy around the world. We don't do democracy in the United States. But on the one hand, by keeping this diverse constituency together behind this concept, in and of itself is, I think, a contribution to that democracy. I grew up in South Carolina. My district is, I'm in Charleston, and so Jim Clyburn has part of Charleston. And Jim Clyburn in town halls in South Carolina, a titan of the House, elderly African-American gentleman who's been there forever, great South Carolina accent. And he comes to South Carolina town halls and he quotes Alexis de Tocqueville. It makes me smile. And the greatness about America is not that we're more enlightened than others, but it's our ability to repair our faults. And here, having my congressman growing up as a black man in South Carolina, I grew up as a kid, as a gay guy in South Carolina. This is not the most welcoming, encouraging environment auspicious for his political career or mine. And yet, I think about the funk we're in right now. And you think about our history. You know, a Washington that was a commander-in-chief that could have gone off the rails, a John Adams that passed Second President Sedition and Alien Act and put all these journalists that criticize him in jail, lead up to a civil war, an incredible civil war in which we held not one Confederate political or military leader accountable for the war. Freedmen's rights rolled back, a kind of a messed up stolen election of 1877, which put a president in office in exchange for rolling back Reconstruction, Jim Crow, 20s anti-immigration, 50s, 60s civil rights movement. My God. I mean, look at the trajectory of democracy in our country. And so, do we have something weird going on right now? Oh my God, we do. Should we be worried about the state of our democracy right now? We absolutely should be. We shouldn't be naive enough to think about this is out of the blue and all of a sudden. This is part of the churn of we got to own it. We got to fix it. We got to take responsibility for it. That has a big impact on my work because people get worried when they see the United States go crazy, when they see us make mistakes, whether it's invading Iraq, having January 6th, whatever. It does create an environment. But over and over again, people watch mobilizations, social movements from the United States that have a big impact. And just talk to many of our colleagues from Black Lives Movement and what it led to, friends who sort of took lessons around the world. So what happens here matters. It matters quite a bit. But I'm still bullish about it. I'm still bullish about the ability to do something about it.
So I'm going to open it up to the audience so you get your questions ready in just a second. But my last one is give you an opportunity to do a commercial, which is give us one or two examples of things that you at the Endowment are doing now that's giving you the most satisfaction, the sunny side, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, let me just start. Look, part of what I love about the Endowment is that this is a place that is about helping. I tell our team that we're talent scouts, not project managers, finding the most amazing people out there doing incredibly work, and our simple job is to identify them and say, how can we help you? It's your struggle, it's your fight. We now have 15 Nobel Peace Prize winners that are among endowment grantees, but none of them came in that way. They all started often as unknown people doing grassroots work. And so you take Ukraine. Putin invaded thinking that he was doing a pincher movement to take Kyiv, take the Ukrainian army. What he didn't understand is what's been happening in Ukrainian society despite bad governance and democracy, the activation of society. And the Endowment had been present since before the fall of the Soviet Union and supporting grassroots groups across Ukraine. It's one of our largest programs. We have partners in Mariupol and Kherson and Sumy, all across the country, including, Shivani knows this well, a NED alum who's with us tonight. And the thing that was just incredible was to see how Ukrainians, how this became a civic movement to defend their freedom, and every Ukrainian had a role to play in this fight. And being at an institution, because we're not a government bureaucracy, because we're set up to be independent, because we're built to take risks, that could all of a sudden say, look, we're here, we're going to be flexible, we're going to pivot with you. One, to see the long-term investments that helped ensure that there was a democratic resilience in Ukraine that Putin didn't understand, because he doesn't understand this. Second, to see the rapid pace that 105 of our partners across the country could pivot to be part of a fight to show that civilians had a role to play in protecting their freedom. And third, right now, what we're doing with many of these partners in Ukraine, the ultimate defeat for Russia and Putinism will not just be a Ukrainian victory on the battlefield, but a Ukraine that emerges that actually is a stronger democracy, that holds itself to account on corruption. And our partners are at the forefront of that agenda to ensure that Ukraine comes out of this stronger. That's exciting. I love it. I'm inspired by it. I was mentioning to some colleagues here before that we're working with a group of defectors from North Korea who've gone through hell to get out of their country, and to see young people, just months for some, years for others, and what they come up with, the innovative ideas, that when their potential is unleashed, and be able to be proud to be able to support their voice, their agency, their organizations. It's something that really, when I think about that, this is the leadership of what should be the leadership of North Korea, and it shows me that human potential When you take off that pressure, you take off that repression and let people do what they want to do, some extraordinary things happen. It's simple, but it's inspiring, it's beautiful. It's what we do every day at the Endowment, and I love it.
That's great. Okay, over to you. Questions from the audience. Start right here. There's a mic coming to you.
Thank you very much for coming down here. I actually knew about this talk months ago, and I timed it right because just months ago, the program officer for Iraq opened up with NED,
That's right.
and that's the one I'm interested in applying for.
All right, fantastic.
So if I say my name 2 times, Darren Pasha, my resume might be
Say it one more
seen
time.
by
Say it one more time.
Darren Pasha.
Darren Pasha. All right, got
It
it.
might stand out from HR, and you can pick it up. And the second factor would be I am Kurdish from Iraq.
Yes.
So I also have worked in Iraq,
Yes.
and I've worked in America. So I have seen the perspective from both sides of like what's going on globally. So I really appreciated having this conversation. What advice would you have for me for applying for this role was a program officer in Iraq? Because I have done many careers in the past. I'm not like some of you all, which are just coming into your career now. I actually have some years on you. I'm not gonna say my age because then I'm gonna like look like I'm older than you all, but I am. So being gay, being Kurdish, makes me stand out. When I remember when Saddam was in power, I actually did a lot of work and I was invited to do lectures and conversation, and it was always that factor that stood out, as the Iraqis and the Arabic side did not like the Kurdish people. It was just somehow you just stood out. So I got to see what life was like when Saddam was in power, and after the war and all of this happened, as you could see, it was very different where Kurdish people benefited a lot from the war, benefited a lot from like what's going on. So you probably saw that from experience.
So let me
Working
give
on
him a
the
chance
Iraq
to.
side, to cut it short
Great.
from a long odyssey, what's your advice for me into coming into this role, hopefully being the program officer? What are you looking for someone to, because I want to take charge of that job. I want to be that person who actually.
Got
yeah.
it.
Good, great, thanks.
Thank you.
So, and let me, and just shape it a little bit. So more broadly, maybe you could say about who are the people who come to work with you, what's it like to do that, right? And then to take advantage of the substantive thing here, maybe you could say a bit, what's it like to work in, especially in the Middle East and Arab countries where you have sort of serious cultural differences about some of the values that we take very seriously, but are contested, to say the least, in some of these societies.
Sure. In fact, the answer is kind of related. I said earlier I like to think of people at the Endowment as talent scouts rather than project managers. And for me, it therefore means it's about people, trust, relationships, knowledge, and humility. So the Endowment works in a way, we speak 55 languages at the Endowment. We'll take a proposal in any of these languages. Our idea is to remove the barrier that you have to respond to a donor, their priorities, do it all in English. You've got to be a high-capacity grantee that can manage your accountants. That's not how we think. And so we want people who understand culture, history, have to speak the languages, and have a real genuine feel for what's real, what's authentic, what's happening here. Because the Endowment, while it's based in Washington, we don't have offices overseas because we don't want anyone to have leverage over us. We don't want to we want to follow U.S. law, not be manipulated by governments that will make you follow their way. Our core institutes, IRI, NDI, they do have field offices. And so the ability to be connected and build relationships of trust is quite different. You can't really, it's hard to do that when you're running a USAID multi-million-dollar grant through contractors and others. We don't do that. We need to be able to go direct, have direct relationships, oftentimes with people who are risking their lives, trust you to protect their identity, how they do this work, be able to do it in their own language, and for us to have an eye towards being able to take bets on investing in grassroots that can have I've just come back from Nigeria, and I met with an individual who was one of our partners during the military junta. And he became part of a core group of people that played an absolutely central role to the transition. And this is part what the endowment does. It's long-term consistent. Because we're not the US government, we don't go like this with policy. We have clarity of mission to support democracy in this global infrastructure around the world. And we believe in that consistency, that sense of trust, that nurturing of that. And to be in Nigeria, see someone who played the role in the transition, to meet another partner, 2 students from Yosh, another university in Nigeria outside the capital 17 years ago, and now they're running the largest youth-led movement that is actually implementing the parallel vote tabulation count for 200 million voters across the country, and to see how they've grown, and we were their first bet. So I call it sort of venture capital for democracy, to take risk, identify people, and to do that, it's judgment, it's trust, it's language skills, it's cultural sensitivity, and it's a healthy damn dose of humility. It's not a made-in-Washington strategy for how the Nigerian people, the Iraqi people are going to get this right. They got to figure it out. They're going to make mistakes. It's going to be nonlinear, and can we be there for the endurance? And that's sort of a little bit how I think about the challenge. And I think, you talked about, even being an out leader of an organization throughout the Middle East or wherever it may be. We try to ground what we do in the absolute respect for local culture, tradition. So the first thing I do, meeting the Uyghur community, is to join them in a meshrap, a traditional family community meal in which the community comes together to pay respect to their culture, to learn their traditions, to understand the dynamics of how it works, to put myself in their shoes and say, we're here just to listen and to learn, and our job is to be modest and to support your efforts. And so to represent, to be who I am, to be clear about that. In many societies, I'll show up to meet with endangered groups, often LGBT community groups. And just by being there, we see oftentimes in many societies, those that are marginalized, it's often, and you saw this actually in Hungary first, you'll see those that are on the margins of society, when they begin to lose their rights, it often doesn't end there. That is often a starting point for the rollback of other democratic freedoms, civil liberties. And so being respectful of culture, tradition, I make the point of going and being seen in places that really matter to the people of that country, thinking about that. But I don't shy away from standing behind those of the most courageous people in that society who are sometimes trying to buck their trends. What I don't do is make it my cause and make it my voice. We want to lend support to their cause and their voice and keep it authentic to their work. And I think that helps us navigate some of those pitfalls.
Next question. Well, we stay over here, and then I'll come over there next.
Hello, thank you for the interesting discussion. I'm visiting researcher at SAIS, but originally I'm from the Czech Republic. Even though I'm focusing mostly on Africa, my question will be about Central Eastern Europe, as I'm coming from there. You were talking about, and I very much appreciate it, about the Czech Republic. Finally, someone is mentioning it again.
I'm a big fan of your new president. I was not a big fan of your last president.
I voted for him twice, so that
He's fantastic.
Yeah, he's amazing. But the thing is that what I wanted to ask is that how do you perceive him becoming president as really some sign of democratization of the Czech Republic? Because there was some backsliding there in recent decade, let's say. Because I'm afraid that the main motivation for a lot of people was not like really the vision or image of more democratic Czech Republic, but rather the fear of war. And it wasn't also like fear of becoming more authoritarian, or there was a lot of admiration for a long time of Russian regime, of Putin, and there were a lot of supporters. But it's rather like the cruelty of the war rather than fear of becoming more authoritarian. Yeah. So that how do you see this as some sign of more democratic Central Eastern Europe? Because for a lot of people it's rather driven by this fear of war. And also him, Pavel, he became acceptable for a lot of people because of his quite a complicated and challenging past, as he became first military officer in under communist regime, and then he became the part of NATO and really became democracy promoter, let's say. But
So let's let Damon answer the question. That's a great question.
yeah, okay, so thank you.
I mean, look, I think the Czech Republic has just shown extraordinarily sophistication and depth in its democracy through a couple of ways. I mean, Czech Republic was the first country, I think Chinese investments at one point were over 10% of GDP. And you saw this wrapped up with some of the things that later came into the financial interests that bled into your politics. Czechs took this on. Czech media, Czech researchers, Czech independent society. It became a big issue, and frankly, it blew up. I won't go through all the details, but the system was tested, and it really responded extraordinarily well, incredibly well, more than most countries. Then emerges really rich person, dominate country's politics. That's part of democracy. It's part of politics. It's part of dealing with responsiveness. It wasn't anti-democratic. There were populist bouts here. And you've watched how that's played out. Yes, a lot of influence and power, but man, you still have a lot of investigative journalists, court cases. Do your institutions, are they able to play that role? And that's where state capture becomes dangerous. And so even in this presidential election, I'm not worried about state capture in the Czech Republic. You might have had a view, the person that was elected is a man of incredible integrity, who, yes, was a military officer in the communist Czech Republic, and then went on to be the highest commanding military officer of the chairman of the military committee at the alliance, and is a real man of integrity. And so I think this is a great test. And America didn't do it, outsiders didn't do it, you do it. I think it does underscore the agency of democracy, that you've got to be active, engaged, be part of this. And I'm not sure if I can even add more. You know it better than I do. You know it better than I do.
Okay, you had a question here? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. I don't know if you remember me.
Of course I do. Welcome.
But overall, the internship last summer at the National Endowment was an eye-opening experience, and I'm very glad that I was able to take part in that. We've seen many setbacks for democratization in the 21st century, from Sudan to Myanmar to Tunisia to Peru. What lessons can we take from these setbacks in ensuring that we can strengthen the voices of democratic movements on the ground?
There are just a string of setbacks. You're right. I'm headed off to Tunisia, and the way I like to think about it is that this isn't a success or failure today. This is going to be a trajectory. This doesn't, this kind of transition, particularly in a society without the democratic culture, habits, institutions that underpin it, is not a short-term thing. So we need to learn from that, whether you're Tunisian, whether you're those of us trying to support that. We need to learn how to be more effective in supporting those who are going through transitions, how to ensure democracy delivers, but we also need to have a little bit of perspective that we don't need to walk away from that. These things are complex and they're complicated, and partly what I'm leaning in on a couple of things at the endowment is a much more intentional learning environment, understanding the ecosystem that we support, so that there is a fostering a cross-movement set of learning. This is a little bit the concept we're trying to breathe into the world movement, of how those on the front lines are comparing notes, learning from each other, learning what mistakes were made. We've seen Russians coach Iranians and Belarusians about how to manage crowd control. We've seen the impact of sort of the cooperation among the autocrats. And so what we're trying to foster is a much more intentional learning and cooperation among those who are working to sustain change, whether it's a successful transition or whether it's in a nonviolent civil resistance movement to begin with. And so this is sort of part of our adaptation of the endowment right now, is understanding the hostile environment It's not a benign environment. It's not a neutral environment. So how do you do this work in a much more hostile environment? How are we advancing from digital and physical security so that people can actually do this, to fostering the learning about what's effective, nonviolent protests, or, well, I won't go through all the data, but to helping many civic movements adapt to which are far more complex systemic challenges, which when they're in a specific environment, having trouble understanding kleptocratic structures, larger scale information ecosystems that they have little impact on, or how technology is being used at scale. And so I see a real innovation challenge for us is how do we connect that grassroots energy, lots of grassroots groups, civic activists that know the lay of the land, authenticity in their communities, with systemic responses and greater learning. And so we're now at the NED trying to be true to that demand-driven process. How are we responding to those who are on the front lines? And yet not just being passive about it, but helping those on the front lines learn from everyone else, help to understand what we're seeing in the ecosystem. And I think what we're seeing now, we aren't winning. So that's putting pressure on us to get better, to innovate, to raise our game. And that's partly why I think, and even in my whole field, how this is pressure to step it up and to figure out how we can be better partners of our partners on the ground and how they can be more effective learning quickly from others. So we just had this whole workshop on folks that were India, Serbia, some Latin America, and folks were learning about how AI-enabled surveillance in their cities, the smart city projects, were being used by governments, and trying to be able to equip civil society, investigative journalists, so that they can get ahead of this in Mauritius rather than behind the curve on some of these, and tipping the balance on some of these. So that's a little bit of how we're experimenting right now with accelerating the learning and rolling that out in broader communities across the world.
So there's a question over here. Yep. No, right up here.
Thank you. My question was, how do you can you inoculate societies, especially democracies, from dysfunction, misinformation? I think I worked in Tunisia in 2019 when there had just been elections. There was a sense of hope, and now there's been a massive retrogression, a constitutional crisis, partially due to a sense it's a popular takeover, probably because of the dysfunction that occurred. Can you prevent that?
I mean, the short answer is the Tunisians are going to have to figure it out. How we can be by their side, support them. It is about helping. I think there is democratic resilience in societies is quite important, and that's where having an engaged civic life is so healthy in your communities. If you think about the United States and think about all the problems, think about all the problems that are addressed and tackled, not because of government, not because of political parties, but because of civic life, because of faith-based groups, because of how people are engaged in life. That was the story of Ukraine's resistance and the protection of its freedom, a mobilization of an entire nation invested in its own freedom. If you think about the disinformation issue, we saw swaths of incredible use of disinformation, and we still see this in having impact in elections. We saw and yet after the debacle in the United States and in other elections that were first tried out first in the East, a major effort was made before the French election to dump the Macron files, and it landed with a big nothing, because there was an educated electorate that had learned from the mistakes of others and seen that it just didn't turn into the political games that it would have otherwise. And so there is a lot to be spoken to, and how do you think about civic education? How do you think about democratic resilience as being stewards of healthy democratic systems? I think Tunisia is a particular example of a real challenge of dysfunction of a parliament that couldn't deliver, a people that saw nothing but bickering among political parties, a real tension underlying it with moderate What's the role of Islam in political life being an underlying issue? Lack of sustained attention from democracies to support it, while very meticulous effort from some in the Gulf and others to ensure that it didn't get a lot of oxygen. And we've seen what it's helped produce. So this is going to be, this is just another, this will be a chapter, and I think many more chapters to come, but I don't think the story is done in Tunisia. I think this is just the midpoint.
So last question right here. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Recently, specifically seeing in Ukraine, and Europe overall, there's a great push to support Ukraine, but by sanctioning Russia and sanctioning their crude oil. However, then that comes back with the financial impact. How can states and organizations who support democracies continue that support despite and offset the financial short-term financial benefit of some authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, maybe I'll just briefly here. I mean, I think the trajectory of the future of democracy and the freedom in the near term in the world hinges a lot on Ukraine. So I think the stakes are extraordinarily high. And in my view, I want to see us do everything feasible without projecting ambivalence, without signaling to the Kremlin our worry about escalation. Nothing matters if Ukraine is defeated. All the stuff we're trying to balance becomes, we've got massive problems if democracy is crushed, if freedom is crushed in Ukraine, and what the knock-on effect will be around the world, and how the cost to what it will mean for American interests and our values will skyrocket over the coming decade. Total disaster. And I think even thinking about what you would put the price tag on that. And so right now, in my view, we've got to be all in how to help the Ukrainians maintain their freedom, understanding that they are doing more than any other to safeguard the concept of democracy and freedom today, and that these issues matter, but they're on the margins, if you think from a historic perspective. I think we haven't even begun to see the cost of what could come out of this if the answer is we didn't do enough and the Ukrainians fail. I think then we're going to be talking about and be really regretful of the cost that we're going to have to pay.
But can I sharpen the question a little bit, because I think it's a great question. I mean, but yes, we should and we will, I hope, do this. But are we losing Russia at the same time we're winning Ukraine? I mean,
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
And I think the question there
Yeah.
is, we look at, public opinion. I mean, there are obviously brave dissidents, and there are people who are leaving Russia. But it's how do you, on the one hand, give a strong and effective message against Putin and his leadership and stuff, and yet, reach the Russian people for them to feel like this is not at their expense.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the question.
We're not, I mean, the best thing that we can do to help the Russian people is to defeat Putin in Ukraine. We don't know what will happen, how things play out in Russia. We do know 1 million people have fled the country since the mobilization. We have seen 500% growth in VPN use to get access to information. We've seen every independent media outlet that's been forced out pretty almost dramatically reset up somewhere in Riga and Lithuania and Berlin and reach larger numbers inside. We've seen YouTube channels still, which are not yet blocked, although that's something that they're working on. 56 Russians are arrested every single day for anti-war activity. There are now 20,000 in jail, many of the people that we know and support. We're supporting an incredible network of Russians that every day are working to get Ukrainians out of filtration camps that are getting them out of Russia back into Western Europe. The best thing for Russia's future is to defeat the tyranny of Putin in Ukraine's battle, and to give a chance of how he will be held accountable in the Game of Thrones of how Russia plays out. We can't manipulate that. We don't know how it will be. but we can't say these desires don't apply to Russians. Yes, I've seen the polling data. Yes, I've seen this. Yes, we know the information environment. Yes, we know history. But I'm not giving up on Russia. I'm not giving up on Russia at all. We did an event last week with Yevgenia Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a good friend of mine. He was Boris Nemtsov's deputy. Boris Nemtsov was assassinated. He helped pick up the mantle with Ilya Yashin. Ilya went to prison first. Now Vladimir's in prison in Moscow. And he sent me a letter from prison just saying, you know, I had no choice. I had to come back to Moscow. I had to speak out. I had to say the truth because I had to ensure that the world understands that Russia's bigger than Putin. And I had to salvage the honor and dignity of my country. And he pointed to 1968 protests in Red Square by 6 people who all ended up going to the Gulag, and one of them has survived and become an amazing woman. And how the dignity of these 6, 7 protesters in 1968 did so much to inspire the next generation of Russian Soviet dissidents. And so I get the scope of where Russia is today. Talk about being in a funk. But I'm not going to turn my back on those people despite that, despite the power, despite the manipulation of the public information environment they're in, the hostile situation they can find themselves in, the number of people that are willing to take extraordinary risks to do what they think's right. We can't control history, but we can control our agency on whether we want to support their agency. And so that's the best I can think about it. That's the best way I can think about it.
That's a terrific note to end on, and a great endorsement of the human spirit, I think. So thank you, Damon, for all you do and for spending the time with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor. Thank you all so much.